We're live.
Live on YouTube. Yeah.
Scary stuff. Well, I'll introduce me. Or are you going to do something first?
Can I go first?
Yeah.
Just give me a sec. Because it's setting up. I just need to make sure. This is also 20-second delay. Oh yeah, we're up there. So I need to mute it on the screen. And then, so what I want to do, I have to make sure I can see the YouTube screen. Okay, I think we are up and running. I don't know if anyone's with us yet, but they might be joining us soon. So welcome to the first and possibly the last, after the headache we've just had with the technology, but what I hope will be a midweek Minister's Muse, because I do like alliteration. If you are joining us and viewing this on YouTube and you're able to comment, please do that so we can see that you're with us. My name's Wendy. I'm the rector of All Saints with Holy Trinity in Loughborough, what I like to call Loughborough's ye olde parish church. And I decided last week that it was far too difficult to preach just on my own with no one to converse with. So I really wanted to talk with other ministers who either themselves are preparing a sermon for that week or would perhaps normally be doing that, because I think it's really important that we listen to scripture within the context of community. So it is great to read the Bible on your own, obviously, but actually the scriptures are meant to be heard with the people of God. So that's the idea of this. I noticed Paul has said hello. Thank you, Paul, so much. That makes me so happy. We did get there in the end. So the idea of this little time together is we're going to talk about the scripture passages that are set for this coming Sunday. It's not a Bible study lecture, but my mystery guests this week have lots of knowledge between them. So, you know, some little pearls of wisdom may well come out as well. But what we would love you to do, if you're watching and you're able to interact, please respond to the passages as well. We won't read them out, so you might want to get a Bible to hand or use an online Bible like the Bible Gateway website, but I will type them in the references as my colleagues introduce themselves. So, gentlemen, I don't know who's going first, but would someone like to say who they are and say hello?
Andrew.
Hi, thank you, Chris. I'm Andrew Lomax. I am Superintendent Minister for the Methodist Church in the Loughborough Circuit. I have responsibility for 3 churches in particular, for Trinity Methodist Church at Royland Road, for Knightthorpe Methodist Church in Loughborough, and also for a church in Woodhouse Eaves, which isn't too far away either. I've been in Loughborough for almost 5 years now. I shall be remaining for at least another 3 years. Prior to this, I was in Lincolnshire for 9 years. Before that, I worked as a photographer for 25 years on a newspaper and as a freelance. So that just about sums me up, I think. I'll pass on to Chris to share a few things about who he is and what he does. Chris.
Thanks, Andrew. I'm Chris. I'm Chris Taylor. I'm the Anglican chaplain at Loughborough University. I'm the virtual Anglican chaplain at Loughborough University because I have lots of virtual meetings. I meet with the students that I would normally have coffee with on Zoom and on Facebook Messenger and on WhatsApp and anything else that happens to be available for use and for meeting with. Obviously, at this time, there are a lot of very anxious young people who don't really understand what's going to happen with their degree, what's going to happen with their studies. And so it's quite important that there are a number of chaplains that are available just to chat with them and set their minds at ease and just generally help them with their personal well-being and with any other questions that we may or may not be able to help them with. It's very rare that I do theology with students, which is why I love things like this, because this is where I can do a degree. A bit. We
can't cope with the whole degree in the next 45 minutes, but we can delve into the scriptures together. So we're going to start with a chat about the gospel reading. So we're in John this coming Sunday, John 10 verse 1 to 10, the Good Shepherd and the Gate. Lots of I ams in John. What strikes you guys? Who wants to kick us off? They've gone quiet now. They've been chattering like nobody's business. I went online.
Well, I'll start. I really enjoy I'm just going to remove my marker, which is over half the reading. I really enjoy the I am sayings, and I always think that with Jesus, when he says very truly, that usually means hang on, pin your ears back, this is important. And the other thing, of course, there are, I think, 7, arguably 8 or 9 I am sayings in John's Gospel, and they're all really important. And this little section here, 10, 1 to 20, has 2 of the I am sayings in it. We're only dealing with the one today. And it's the one that people don't really necessarily get when Jesus says, I am the gate for the sheep. And to me, that's, looking at that, how really exciting that is. I'm a door. I'm a gate. Well, great. I'm not the light that came into the world. I'm not the good shepherd. I'm a gate. And actually, for us today, that's what a gate is. It's a piece of wood or a piece of metal that gets you from one place to another. It's liminal. It's all those important things, but it's not really inspiring. But if you were a Jew listening to Jesus speaking at that time, you'd be thinking about the gates of heaven. You'd be thinking about the gates of righteousness, the really beautiful golden pearly gates that you'd be walking through to get from this life to God's place in heaven. And that's in some of the Psalms, open up those gates. And Jesus is saying that if you want to get those gates open, you have to come through me. I'll shut up now.
See, that's really interesting, because I'm sure I've heard a different interpretation on that, and I can't quote you the source. But the idea, and I don't know if this is true or not, that in Middle Eastern ancient culture, the shepherd is the gate. So there's something about the physicality. I always talk with my hands, but that the shepherd actually lies down in front of an enclosure, and so becomes the gate in a way that's not our 5-bar gate. I can't remember where I read that. I may have.
That sounds very Berkeley.
William Berkeley.
Yeah.
I knew there's a reason we invited you, Chris. And Andrew, what strikes you?
Like you, I've always heard the idea that the pen was simply an open pen, a place of safety, but there was no physical barrier to prevent the sheep going in and out. And literally the shepherd slept in the gap. So literally the shepherd became the gate for the sheep to come in and out. What I find intriguing about the idea of the gate is that the sheep can go in and out. And if we think about Jesus, we think about he is the way to God. And the idea that we can come and go is very much about a free will choice. We don't decide we're going to come in, and once we're in, and we're never going to be out again. We have to make that decision to remain. We're not held prisoner because we have gone in through the gate. It is very much our choice to remain there. And in remaining there, it's a question of obedience. And I think the idea of obedience comes in, or will come in, when I start talking about the passage from Peter. So I think there's a link there with that particular passage. It's not just the idea of the shepherd that's a link between the different passages. It's odd because, yes, this is one of the I am sayings, the 7 I am sayings, or 8 or 9, as Chris says, are very, very significant. But for me, in this passage, a more important piece is a very famous piece where Jesus says, I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. For me, that is more to preach on, if you like, and then trying to talk about Jesus as a gate.
I think that's where I am in my head a little bit. The verse 10 was the strapline for my job a number of years ago when I was a school chaplain. I think it was the NIV translation. I came that they might have life and have it in all its fullness. The one I've got in front of me, I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. I think as well, I've got in my mind that the Peter passage that we'll look at as well, because that talks about suffering. And I'm wondering, what does it mean to have fullness of life, abundant life? What does fullness of life look like at the minute in our lockdown world and the different contexts? So I think I'm drawn there a little bit.
I've got a thing I want to throw in, if I can.
No.
There's a psalm. There's a psalm for today, for Sunday as well, which is Psalm 23, which speaks of abundance. Thou preparest the table before me in the presence of mine enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. So there's a very obvious link with abundance between the psalm and this reading. There is another link. There's an inclusive link in here, but it isn't actually in the 1 to 10. It comes a little bit after, when Jesus says he has other sheep in other folds. So he's not, and so there's a huge inclusive. This is a really important bit of the inclusive Bible, when Jesus says that he has other sheep in other folds. There are all these other cohorts out there that Jesus is reaching out to and reaching across the centuries to as well, I think. And never forget that with this passage sits for me as 1 to 20, not 1 to 10. I know the lectioners have taken 1 to 10, but there's that really important bit in there. And the Good Shepherd. I would take issue with you both on this idea of the shepherd lying down. I love it. It's a beautiful picture. But he says the gatekeeper opens the gate for him in verse 3.
Yeah.
So it suggests to me that there is some sort of hinged contraption, or even it may just be a piece of wood that the gatekeeper has to lift and open.
Can I split biblical hairs though? Because I think
go for it. Well, not with me, you can't. No.
This will really pull the crowds in. They're two different. So it's two different metaphors. So the top one is, I tell him who doesn't enter the sheepfold by the gate. Yeah, in the first one, he is being the shepherd, isn't he? And then, very true, yes, I'm the gate. So I think. And
then he's the shepherd again.
Yeah, 1 to 6, he's the shepherd, and the gatekeeper opens it. But then he's being the gate in verse 7 onwards.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I get too hung up on that.
I'll let that one go quite happily.
I'm not sure that's what inspires for a sermon, but
there's a wonderful thing as well in here that I think sometimes people miss, which is that whoever enters by me will be saved. Now, this I think there's been a whole load of thinking about turn to Jesus and be saved, in this life. That's not what this says. Jesus says, I am the gate. Yeah. The assumption for me is that everybody has to go through the gate to get wherever the next place is. And if Jesus is the gate and that's opened, the opportunity to turn to Jesus and go, oh yeah, I listened to that Wendy Dalrymple rabbiting about God and Jesus a few years ago. I didn't take it seriously. And then I nipped down the Methodist because they had a good pizza night. And now Andrew Lomax started talking about, salvation and everything else. But it didn't actually strike a chord. But when you get to meet Jesus as the gate, you then go, oh, they were right. Thanks a lot. So you have that opportunity for salvation, not only in this life, but post-mortem as well. This is Anglican orthodoxy, by the way. It isn't just me banging on. There's a book that the Doctrine Commission of the Church of England published, and it's called Salvation. And this is one of the things it says, that salvation doesn't have to happen in this life. You maybe don't have to turn to Jesus and be saved until post-mortem, a bit like Harry Potter and Paddington Station.
That's a whole nother.
Well, at least it's not Doctor Who.
Oh, those are the best. Those are the best sermons. We could probably spend another hour on what does it mean to be saved and salvation. Yeah, but I wonder if we should neatly sidestep to the epistle to 1 Peter. You ready to do that?
Yeah.
I'll find it.
So my big query with the lectionary compilers is so I thought, oh great, we're going to do the epistle Peter. I might make that a sermon series, and then there's a few little there's random chunks, and then for some reason next week we go backwards again. So I don't quite know why that is, but anyway, this week it's all about suffering, and the lectionary rather neatly cuts off the first verse about slavery, which is difficult, and then stops short before wives and husbands. So I'm challenged by this epistle. But Andrew, you were saying the gospel and this 1 Peter text really fit together. Do you want to kick us off with what you were thinking?
Well, submission and obedience were the two words that came to me particularly. I mean, the obvious link with the shepherd is the verse 25. You were like sheep that had gone astray, but now you have returned to the shepherd. Something about returning to the shepherd shows a willingness to be with Christ, and therefore I would suggest a desire to actually be obedient. The earlier part of the reading, Peter says, talking about Jesus, they hurled their insults at him. He didn't retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in the body on the tree so that we might die to sin and live for righteousness. For me, that is describing the obedience of Jesus. Not that God wanted him to suffer, but as a consequence of following what his Father had asked him to do, and then suffering came along with it. But when suffering came along, Jesus didn't then say, okay, I'm giving up on this one now. He may well have prayed in the garden that the cup of suffering could be taken away, but at the same time, he also said, not my will, but yours be done. And so there's that sense in which he is being obedient, he is submitting to God's will, and that is an example for us, because our following of Jesus is not meant to be like my following of Manchester City Football Club. You ask me which football team I support, it is Manchester City. And the only reason I can say that is because when I was about 7, I had a pendant on my wall in the bedroom for Manchester City. I've never seen them play. I know nothing about them, but I am a follower of Manchester City. We're not called to follow Jesus like that, are we? We are called to be obedient to the teaching that Jesus has given us. Not to our interpretation of how Paul sees the teaching of Jesus. I think sometimes we don't spend enough time in the Gospels actually trying to work out just what the teaching of Jesus means for us. So this is very much in this letter, I think, an encouragement to submit and to be obedient to what Christ has taught us in those Gospel passages.
That's really powerful. I'm making copious sermon notes. If you listen to me on Sunday, you may hear, although I can't say with any integrity, I follow Manchester City. But I think that's a really good analogy, and I really like that. I mean, how do we reconcile though these two things of the call to Christian life, which is almost to a call to suffer, with the abundant life bit? And I don't know, I mean, maybe we're the blip in history because we and particularly in the West, we've had a very unsuffering following of Christ on the whole. And maybe that's just not the norm. And there's something there, I suppose. But there's two, they're slightly in tension, aren't they?
I would say that you can live abundantly even within suffering. Now, having said that, I cannot say that I've ever suffered in my life because I don't consider anything that I've been through to be suffering compared to what an awful lot of other people I know go through. When you think about who the happiest people on earth are, they are usually the people who have nothing. And the most miserable are the ones who have everything and they're wanting to hold on to it. And so my sister-in-law worked as a doctor in Ethiopia 20 odd years ago now. And when my in-laws went out to visit her, they described the country as being very much like the Middle Ages. and yet those people were happy. They had absolutely nothing, but there was a contentedness, I think, and a fullness of life in them that a lot of people in the West do not have, with all the possessions that we have. It's hard to relate the suffering side of things when you think about some people's suffering. It would be interesting to know the stories that come out of the key workers over the last few months and the next few months, who have given themselves in such a way as they are suffering to the point of death, some of them, certainly suffering to the point of illness with others who survive. And to know what riches come out of that. It would be interesting to hear those stories when they do finally come out. It is difficult to relate to the slavery side of suffering, which, as you said, the lectionary seems to skip that first verse, doesn't it? And you know, you read the passage, the whole passage before and afterwards about wives obeying their husbands, about slaves obeying their masters, and it grates enormously for all of us, I think. And I simply ask myself, what suffering is there in the world today that I can relate to, that the people in our churches might relate to? For me, it does obviously revolve around the virus. Families losing loved ones, people struggling with fear, having to work in environments where there is COVID. And some people think they're suffering just because they can't go out of their house, even though their fridge is full. They have a garden to walk around. They have the internet that works most of the time. Depends on how you understand suffering, doesn't it?
Yeah, there's definitely a relativity, isn't there?
Yeah.
I think the thing that I'm mindful of when dealing with these passages, and against being in the news this morning, issues of domestic violence are always with us. They appear to be on the increase because of lockdown, and that doesn't surprise me. And I'm just aware as well how at times this kind of passage and this kind of teaching has encouraged servitude, or the kind of submission. I guess my skin always slightly goes funny when we use the submission word, and where that's been used inappropriately. And I would really want people to hear and know that it's never okay, or it is okay to leave a situation if you are suffering at the hands of someone else. And I know that's not what you wouldn't suggest anything different, Andrew. I know, but I'm just aware of that being a bit of the backdrop really to preaching this kind of text on Sunday. But Chris, you've been quiet.
No, I'll let you two. I love this idea of the self-giving of the key workers, even unto death. But something that was said really early on about we don't really know what suffering is, or the suggestion that we in the healthy and relatively wealthy West don't really understand suffering. I don't think we understand suffering in the biblical sense of being crucified and whipped and all that sort of thing. But I think, you know, those people that are at home with full fridges and functioning internet may well still have a deep and serious mental health issue with being shut in their houses, which is one thing that occurred to me. So we can't really just sort of dismiss them because their fridges are full and they're comfortably off and in a relatively good situation. What they feel is what they feel, and how they are is how they are. And I think there's also something, and this is my sort of latent mini socialist that leaps in situations like this. We're all slaves. We're slaves to paymasters. We get up at 9. We get sent to school when we're 3.5, 4. Out of the house between 9 and 3, and then 9 and 4, and then we go to university and we have a little break if we're lucky enough to go to university, and then we're out of the house 9 to 5 if we're fortunate inverted commas enough to have a job, and we're a slave to someone else. It's just a different sort of slavery. There's this relentless pressure to conform to 9 to 5. To work hard, to be present. I found I'm a victim of feeling that the need to be busy whilst in this lockdown. So there are lots of people out there who'll be thinking, well, hey, whoopee do, I don't have to go to work. But actually, it's the opposite with me. I find myself making more things to do and enjoying them, but yeah, there's that tyranny of needing to be working and seen to work and all that stuff. So there are all sorts of different slavery, is what I'm saying. It's not just the indenturedness. There are all sorts of other sorts of slavery. You take a mortgage, you're enslaved to that. You've got to pay it or you lose the roof over your head. Enough of that.
I feel a very different sort of sermon coming on, a very different one. I mean, there is the tension, isn't there, that again, this kind of stuff, or when do you challenge unjust systems? And we know in the past this kind of texts have been used to support slavery and social structures as they were. I mean, Andrew, you referred to earlier, and I like that thing about what do we pay attention to in the scriptures, and are we following epistles or are we following Jesus? And sometimes they line up and sometimes seems to be a bit of a tension. And I guess at different times in our culture and history, we've butted up against different things. And for me, in some ways, I do find this epistle, well, it's not my world. It's a very different cultural world to the one I'm in. So there's an awful lot of cultural translating to do to get back to what is Jesus asking me to do in this.
I mean, in our context, it could be that Jesus is just saying, don't settle for being comfortable. Don't settle for stuff. Yeah. Take yourself into a new place and a different and challenging place for me, for the gospel, for the kingdom. You know, for a slave who is being maltreated by his owner, so abused by owner, yeah, it's that ability, and I've heard this preached many times, that ability to set yourself to do the best that you can because you're following Christ, not because you're someone's slave. So, you know, yeah, it works.
And I wonder if actually, again, the lectionary doesn't always help us the little bit before, unless we get this next week. It really confuses me, the lectionary sometimes. Does it go back there? No, I don't think it does. So the verse from verse 11, to live as servants of God, it's sort of, so you get love the family of believers, fear God, honour the emperor, honour everyone. And as servants of God, this is verse 16, as servants of God, live as free people. Yet do not use your freedom as a pretext for evil. I like that verse. I think I can preach that verse.
So there's an argument here. There's a series of metaphors that there's not actually necessarily addressing slaves as such, wives as such, aliens and exiles as such. He's the heart of this. If you actually look, the hinge of the whole of chapter 2 of 1 Peter is live as free people. I'm pretty sure that's no accident.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just very briefly going back to the whole suffering bit, verse 20, second half of verse 20. But if you suffer for doing good and endure it, this is commendable before God. I wouldn't encourage people to suffer for the sake of it. And I think you're right, Wendy, that we need to call it out when it needs to be called out. That certainly when it comes to abuse and relationships like that, people need to walk away if that's appropriate. But what went through my mind reading this was really the standing up for those people who are oppressed, and particularly thinking about the current COVID situation. When this all began, because it began in China, Chinese people were seen then as the culprits and became the victims outside of China. And we did have some good news stories where people were attacked and others around actually stood up and defended them. And it's that standing up and suffering alongside those people who are under attack, which is the good thing that we should be doing. It's not good that anybody has to suffer, but it is a good thing that is being done because it's the right thing.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's really powerful. Shall we shimmy our way into Acts? If you're a follower of the lectionary, you will know that every Sunday during the Easter season, we have a passage from Acts, We finally finished Peter's speech, which goes on forever.
Sure.
We go back again on Pentecost, but we are at, let me just get the reference right, Acts 2:42 to the end. Who wants to kick us off?
Why don't you go this time, Wendy?
Oh, is it my turn? Okay. Well, I mean, there's some lovely obvious sermons here, which would be different to the other ones we've talked about. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers. And I suppose the obvious thing in my mind, I half thought I might do a sermon series on what the church is for during these weeks of Easter, because I guess we're really at a point of reevaluating that, aren't we? We can't go to our buildings where there's an opportunity to be doing things differently. There's an awful lot of ink being spilt or fingers on keypads being typed about whether or not you can have the Eucharist, communion, Lord's Supper in your home. You know, what does it mean to break bread? I've got both sides of the divide and everywhere in the middle. So there's all of that, but in that cameo, the importance of the teaching, of the learning, the importance of community. I probably am leaning on the side of, I do think when it says to break bread, it is formulaic and it is talking about Eucharistic worship, but that's an Anglo-Catholic possibly reading back into the scripture what she wants to see, and the prayers, but certainly worship, prayer, learning, community. And I don't know what I'm doing in this new virtual world, trying to grapple with technology and definitely making up as I go along, but I think that verse probably sums up the DNA of what instinctively I'm wanting to still try and maintain, support, lead in, because that is a bit of the nub of what it means to be the church, the body of Christ. I think that's where I'd start.
It's very much about community, isn't it? It is a new community. And one thing I think that I've noticed since we've not been able to take worship in our buildings, worshipping through Facebook as we have done for the last 5-6 weeks, there is a real sense of community and togetherness, even though we're all separated. The lovely thing about Facebook is we go live a few minutes before the service starts, and you see people saying hello to each other as they come into the room, as it were, and you see the numbers of people gathering increasing. I don't have the screen facing me when I take the service, so I don't know what else is going on, but I'm able to look back on some of the comments later on. When I speak to people during the week, they do sense that community, and it's great to be able to hold that together, knowing that a grandma in Loughborough who comes to the church is worshipping with her children and grandchildren who live in different parts of the country, but they all know they're in that one space together, worshipping God as a community. A very different kind of community than we'd normally have, a much larger community than we would normally have, but still very much a sense of community. And one of the things I did on Easter Day, because we couldn't celebrate Holy Communion, we had a love feast. So everyone was told beforehand to get something to eat, get something to drink, didn't matter what it was, water and Easter eggs or bread and coffee or something. And then at a certain point in the service, I had a whole load of photographs that I'd encouraged people to send me during the week of what they've been up to. And so I had a PowerPoint presentation to put out. I said a prayer before we started. I said, right, this is a time of fellowship. You can make any comments you want in the boxes, talk to each other. And I'll show you the photographs that have been sent to me, so people were able to see pictures of each other and some of the things that I've been up to. And then I closed that when we came to the end of it with another prayer. Very strange kind of love feast from the way you do it in church. But it helped, I think, with that sense of community. Because normally people just get to see me in the service. But being able to bring photographs in during the week and show them in the service meant that, oh yeah, they can see so-and-so and pass on comments to different people. And and this fellowship of the believers is all about community, and a growing community and a new community. And I mean, the end of it talks about the numbers who were, the Lord added to their number those who were being saved. And I just get the impression that there were probably not just Jews that were being added to the numbers, but sheep of another fold.
beautifully linked into
you.
the gospel. You see what you did there. That was very impressive. Chris, where do you go with this passage?
Well, I'd love to pick you up on the virtual communion thing to start with. Why is it that all these ordained folk want to prevent God operating across computer screens and into people's homes when they can't gather in church?
We've not written a canon for it yet.
Sorry?
We've not written a canon for it yet.
No, but it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because and I know loads of ink's been spilt, and I know there are loads of blistered fingers, but I love the idea of the love feast, the agape, that you could do, but why not just say we're in extraordinary circumstances? God knows we're in extraordinary circumstances. Let's be a new church that's open to new understandings. Let's not be hidebound in the way that we're hidebound by our buildings, hidebound by some doctrine, and some exclusion and some ancient understanding of ancient wordings. Why can't we, in these new situations, these new and difficult times, allow God to operate in ways that God will be who God will be? I don't actually understand why it can't work. And this passage is about a new church, and why we can't have new understandings and a new church, and echo that in these times. This virus ain't going to go away for at least 18 months. And I really, people, as you say, Andrew, are cutting up rough about not getting outside and not doing this and not doing that. People assume Christians are going to be cutting up rough about not getting communion. He says. So there's my little rant. And why can't we be the new church? Why do we have to be, and to come back to what Andrew and I were talking about before we kicked off today, why do we have to be a slave church, slave to tradition and slave to ancient and vested understandings? There we go.
I think I need another hour to come back at you a bit. I mean, so at All Saints, those of you who watch will know we do a Eucharist service on a Sunday, and it's edited through the week, so it's not live. So I have the really bizarre experience on Sunday morning of being led by myself through the Eucharist with me on the screen and me at home. But sort of and the liturgy is led by lots of different people. So lots of different people take part. And yeah, I'm pretty sure Jesus really doesn't have a problem if you're at home sitting with bread and wine.
So am I.
However, I decided that I would follow, if you like, the prayer book stuff. So we invite people to make their spiritual communion. And I suppose I haven't quite worked out my theology of what it is I think I'm doing. I'm slightly going to worry about the theology later and reflect on it as I do it. But for me, there's something really important about my priestly function in my church community of continuing to offer the sacrament. And I think and it's interesting when I watch it back. So we put our communion service out at the same time on a Sunday morning, so that the majority of people will watch it at the same time. And I've got some comments coming through. I'll read them out in a second. But when I'm watching myself do it, I don't feel the need to get bread and wine again. There's something slightly different happening when we're watching it. And then I was really challenged, although I don't think I'm going to change my mind, but Julie Gittos, who's a fantastic contemporary theologian of the church, wrote a piece in Church Times last week on why she's fasting from the Eucharist. And she's probably more sacramental than I am, and I think for me, this slightly ties in with the suffering bit. I think a bit for her, there's something about abstaining from the Eucharist in the way we would normally do it that is more honouring to this sort of halfway house online. And I can see that. I can. But
it doesn't honour this reading, does it?
Well, yeah.
I mean, why,
but we're not all together in one house, are we? But we're not.
We can't actually do what Jesus. Well, we are. We're all together in a virtual house, but we can't actually do. I mean, another rant coming on. We see, Jesus never ordained drinking wine and eating bread. What Jesus ordained was washing feet, and he did that and said, "Go and do this." Yeah, be like me, wash feet. Not be like me, drink wine. Be like me, eat bread. It was be like me, wash feet. be servants.
Yeah, which might
Anyway, just another one.
nicely to some comments, which is excellent. Rachel, we have one person commenting. Rachel, thank you. You are making us feel like this is worthwhile. So Rachel's been enjoying discussion, and she says about the Acts passage, I see this as linking to some of the community action stuff, taking care of each other's physical needs within the community, which also helps care for spiritual needs in fellowship, like that. Current food bank issues are relevant. Selling property and possessions to provide for those in the community struggling is a huge challenge. And we talked about that, the second part of that Acts passage.
You can only give it away once. Then you'll be using other people's.
Chris, wait for it. We've unleashed the rant now. If Wendy could pop back on the Eucharist thing, I'd find that really helpful on my discernment process. Rachel, I'll pick that up with you. I perhaps won't put you in the middle of me and Chris. Yeah, the second bit of it, of course, this slightly idealized version, and this does get thrown out, doesn't it, a little bit like, oh, we need to be like the early church. They all shared their possessions. So verse 44, all who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all as any had need. Is this a biblical mandate for communism or for us all living in a commune? Or is it more nuanced than that? Discuss. I'm going to throw the ball to Andrew just while Chris lets the steam finish coming out of his ears.
I'm fine.
I wouldn't describe it as communism. I'd describe it as socialism, which is not the same thing. And I would describe Jesus as a socialist. You're right. It is idealized. But if you've got someone who's in need, and you can supply that need, you do. And that's what people do. And I think the acts of generosity that we're seeing at the moment are incredible. I mean, just think about the amount of money that Captain Tom, was it?
Yeah.
Captain Tom Moore, nearly £30 million. People responded. There's something about, I guess, being trapped in our own houses. We're not going out. We're not buying fuel for the car. We're not buying coffee out. Theoretically, we're all saving lots of money. So therefore, people have got lots of money burning holes in their pocket. There's a lot of charities out there that are really struggling. And it's great that there are people responding very generously. And that's, I would suggest that's socialism. Somebody would say, well, actually, socialism is the state doing this. Well, actually, look at what the state's doing at the moment. We've probably got the most socialist government that we've had for a long time. But that's probably something else that somebody can rant about.
That's definitely a different podcast video thing.
Yeah. But we are called to be generous, and I've been amazed at the generosity that I've seen within the churches. You know, we put appeals out, and people put their hands in their pockets, and it's not just churches; it's people all over the country. There was something the other day, wasn't there, on the BBC? Was it Comic Relief coming together with the BBC Children in Need one? Put together very much at the last minute, still raised millions and millions of pounds. I think you've got to go a long way when you get to the point of actually selling everything you have, because we've not quite got to the point of giving away the surplus that we have, let alone the everything that we have. Giving away the surplus that we have would make a huge difference. Giving away everything, well, that will become a rant if I go on about that one. And the advantage that certain wealthy people would take of other people giving away things. But I'll stop there.
Yeah. Oh, can I carry on then? Because I think where you might be going with that is that if we redistributed the world's wealth equally among every single individual person in the world, so currently I think it's 1% of the world owns 90% of the wealth. If you then redistribute,
you can always make up a good statistic, Chris.
Yeah, no, I mean, you can look it up. The idea is that within a decade, maybe even less, the distribution would still be that 1% hold this and that hold 90%, and the rest of us sort of grapple and grovel for the 10. It's an interesting one, and Jesus actually had stuff to say on this when he said the poor are always with you. And there's no way around it, because human nature is such that you know, people will always be, some people will always be greedy, and some people will always be giving, and some people will always be stupid and greedy and therefore poor. But to go to what we were talking about before this all kicked off, we were talking about what actually happened to the early church and why it got the name of being a slave religion in early Rome. And it was called a slave religion because what happened was all these generous, wealthy Christians sold all they had, unless they were, what was the name of that couple that Paul blasted to pieces for lying to him and keeping a field or something? But apart from them, everybody sold all they had, put it in a common pot, and they used it to free faithful slaves who were you know, part of the early Christian church, and they very nearly bankrupted themselves. So it was a very poor church, and it was a very bankrupt church where they had actually, Andrew, given everything away, and ended up buying lots of slaves and lots of faithful people who they were showing their love for. But you can only do that for so long, and then the slaves that are still in slavery and want to come out and be Christian can't, because there's no money left in the pot. It's an interesting one. If you've read Paula Gooder's lovely story Phoebe, and not bothered with all the gumph at the back end about what we need to be thinking about and reflecting on, but just read the story, it's a cracking yarn about the early church and the mix of people that were in there and how they all, you know, it's just a novel. It's a yarn, but it's a good yarn. Recommend it.
I would thoroughly recommend Phoebe as well, actually. It's very good. I don't think the back was guff, actually, Chris. I enjoyed all of it.
Well, yeah, well, you see, I don't have that brain that says, I've read this good story, now I want to reflect on it, any more than I was reflecting on it whilst I was reading it. Do you see what I mean?
I do. I enjoyed it though. We're coming near to the end, and I'm unstable again, which is not a comment on my theological well-being, but my internet is playing up. But thank the Lord, we've nearly got to the end of the hour. I just want to share a couple more comments to come up. Rachel did raise quite rightly, pointing out that I think for some people, yeah, they've not got money in their pocket to burn. They've been furloughed and perhaps or lost their job. There's definitely different stories going on for folk at the minute, isn't there? And Philippa says maybe more of a challenge to make generous giving a regular part of life and not just a one-off thing for a particular cause. I would definitely echo that's really hard, isn't it? Especially when you're responsible for a church and the ongoing life of paying the bills and all that stuff. It's much harder to encourage people to be generous for that. And Paul Oakley, thank you, Paul. Ananias and Sapphira, those were those
thank you.
Going to trouble. Thank you, Paul. So we're coming to the end. We said we'd do 2 till 3. We're a bit late starting, but we will finish at 3. My last thing, if you could sum up maybe in just no more than 1 minute, if you were preaching this Sunday, because I think it might be only me that is preaching, but thank you for doing the work for me. Where would you go? What's your where do you think your sermon might direct on Sunday? Anyone want to answer that?
Well, I think I've already mentioned submission and obedience, and I think following. And just going back to what I said earlier on, very much about trying to help people to understand what Jesus taught and what it means. I mean, it's the wonderful story that Jesus told, isn't there, about the man who built his house on a rock and the man who built his house on the sand. And what Jesus then said was, if you build your house, I can't remember the actual phraseology of it now, but build your house on my teaching is what he said. He didn't describe himself as the rock. He didn't say, I am the rock. He said, I am the cornerstone. He said various other things later on, which is different. But actually building our lives on the teaching of Jesus. And if we're going to do that, we need to know it. And we need to read the Gospels and reread the Gospels. And not just pick and choose, but actually focus on what it is to actually follow in such a way that we are more connected than I am with Manchester City Football Club.
Thank you. I can't use that exact analogy, but I love it. Chris, where would you go if you were preaching this Sunday? What do you feel?
I'd go straight to the Gospel. I'd contextualize it, talking about who the thieves and bandits are. Jesus is clearly talking about Pharisees and stumbling blocks here, teaching from the temple and a complete lack of regard for God being the God of love. the people in the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the scribes getting in the way, and being the bandits that have come in and pretended to be shepherds. They're not really shepherds at all. And there's something there as well that I'd talk about the words of Jesus speaking into our hearts today, across the centuries, telling us the truth, telling us and how they appeal to us, that they speak sense. They speak sense to anyone of a good heart, not just Christians. Andrew said, quintessential socialist. This is common sense, all enthroned in love. And that would be the heart of my sermon.
Thank you. And I'm not sure yet, because you've thrown up lots of interesting things for me to run with, but I think I'm still drawn to the abundant life, fullness of life, and probably the two threads. What does it mean to have fullness of life, even in the face of suffering, which is costly because we're following Jesus? But also, I may pick up on that psalm. I love what you said, Chris, there.
Try and get someone to sing it during the week when you're recording. Get someone to sing Psalm 23 as part of your worship.
I know someone who could do that. I do.
I know you do.
Fullness of life, but I think also this thing around what we're learning about giving away, around generosity, about a different way of living. There may be a fullness of life that we perhaps haven't seen. So maybe that's where I go. But who knows? I may have written 3 versions before we get to Sunday. I want to say a huge thank you both to Andrew and Chris for joining in this little experiment. I've been really enriched by it. I hope if you've joined in at home, you've enjoyed it too. We've got a couple more just final comments. That if there's space for discussion group exploring online Eucharist, I'd be interested in participating. Oh, excellent. Right, lots of things to follow up. So I'm going to take us offline. So we will say goodbye.
Bye.
I don't know quite how to go offline. It might take us. I'm going to stop the live stream. I'm going to press that button.
That's the one.
Goodbye to everyone who's listening at home.